Happy Friday, everyone, and welcome to the Freedom from the Press podcast. My name is Jason Robertson. I'm here with my partner in crime.
Folks, Todd Peterson, good to have you with us today. And Jason, we are going doom and gloom this week. Right after a great interview with Mayor Trent Staggs last week, we had the optimism of the country. We have a future U.S. Senator to bring America First policies to D.C. Today, it's a little bit of a different story as we break down the end of the U.S. dollar and what that means for you.
Yeah, and I got to say, last week's episode was amazing. We got to interview the replacement for Mitt Romney. So if you haven't checked it out, go out and check it out. And probably the most shocking part, in their first delegate vote, he got 70%. And the establishment is spending $10 million to try to stop him from getting the nomination in just a week or two. It's remarkable.
Yeah, check out the podcast. He talks about the Rhino Protection Act. So after based Mike Lee won a Senate seat in 2010, he booted out an establishment character there. They had to go and enact the establishment in the state of Utah to make sure that folks like him couldn't get through again. Even with 70% of the delegate count, he should have swept his way to the nomination, been the Republican senator of Utah in November, but the establishment is afraid of folks with an America First agenda. And that's what we're going to talk about today as well, as we talk about how do we get America back on track, if that's possible, Jason. I'm excited for our guest today to break that down.
Yeah, I got to say, we break down the financial end, I think, is, or the financial ramifications of the upcoming election, or that's going to be the turn that wakes up Americans. You know, people aren't waking up with necessarily the DEI stuff or some of the LGBTQ stuff. A lot of Americans are, but once it starts hitting your pocketbook, and right now people are having a hard time buying groceries, they're having a hard time filling their gas tank, they're having a hard time just living. And you see this oligarch where the corporations are getting rich, the middle class is getting squeezed out, they're creating a welfare state between just poor people and illegal immigrants. This is what's gonna fundamentally change America. And Todd and I are a couple of yahoos. Like, we know enough, we read stuff, we hear stuff, but we went out and the universe put Ben Kelleran in our purview. And I'll let him do an introduction to himself, but he was a CPA, he worked in for big company. He decided to go out on his own, and he kind of woke up from the Matrix. So, but knows a lot. Now, I got to say, especially if Todd and I say something, we are not giving financial advice. We are just sharing our own experiences and our own opinions. So we don't want to get sued for giving you bad financial advice. But I will say, if you are looking for a way to protect your investments, go to handsoffmywealth.com.
Handsoffmywealth.com. Jason, is it too early for a read?
Oh, Todd, go for it.
Folks, listen up. Right now, it looks like the government's pushing for a digital dollar, which could mean every penny you spend could be tracked and controlled by the government. If that's true, then your entire life could depend on people you don't know, like, or trust. That's why smart Americans are opting out and putting some of their savings into real gold and silver. So to help, you can go to handsoffmywealth.com to get a free 2024 gold IRA kit from our partners at Goldco. It shows how to protect your hard-earned money with physical gold and silver, even if it's still in a retirement account. And as an American citizen, you could score up to $10,000 in free silver just for safeguarding your savings. At the very least, arm yourself with knowledge about your options here. Don't be a sheep. Go to handsoffmywealth.com or click on the link in the video description now to get your free 2024 gold IR kit now.
And I will say, Todd and I are not just promoters. We're also customers of theirs.
I got to get mine for the show. You always have yours to show up, Jason.
Yeah, I was going to say, I always have one on the desk.
Got that in your pocket right there.
Yeah, like, folks, if you aren't stocking up on a little silver and gold, you don't know what you're missing.
I will say, Jason, my family hates it. I've got my gold dollars, my silver dollars. My kid, my 4-year-old, loves to play with it. She thinks it's the coolest thing to put in her little play cash register. So teaching them young and early to enjoy those precious metals.
Absolutely. And folks, do us one other favor before we bring our guest on. So when you start with talking about something like the death of the U.S. dollar, the regime wants to suppress that. So, you know, it's funny as we look out, we've got 3 million follower Facebook pages that Facebook has fed it to like 20, 30 people. So hit that like button, hit that share button to help get the word out. And I always tell everybody, share this content with people you might not politically agree with, because while Todd and I are conservatives, we love President Trump, everybody in America needs to understand what's happening to our economy, what illegal immigration's doing to our economy. And the first story we're going to dive into is the petrodollar. So, Todd, any framing up on the petrodollar before we get into it?
We can let our guest, Ben Kelleran, I know he's waiting patiently to hop on the show here. I think, folks, the number one takeaway is that the United States might have been the global superpower for the last, 70 years, ever since the end of World War II. Times are changing. The US dollar is the global reserve currency. That means, for lack of a better word, the petrodollar was in place. Everyone that purchased oil, especially from Saudi Arabia, the biggest manufacturer, transacted in US dollars. That is fastly changing here. Jason, I'm just going to go to Wikipedia because we're going to a leftist big tech source. If you don't believe us, believe them. We're talking about a membership organization that has about 30% of the world's land surface, 45% of the global population, and nearly a quarter of the global GDP. They are all teaming up against the United States, and you better believe that they are coming in full force to dethrone the United States with our money, with our military power. There's a lot going on right there to unpack.
Yeah, and like I say, this is when Americans really start waking up. They're seeing groceries are too expensive. Their government saying, "Oh, inflation's down," and I mean, shoot, the wife and I are making our grocery list for the weekend, and it's like, "Oh no, we got to get laundry soap and we got to get paper towels." Like, I might need to take out a second mortgage on the house, like it's expensive. But hey, why don't we bring Ben on? And I got to say, folks, I'm really excited. Like, we've just chatted with Ben a little bit online, and we're doing our pre-show prep, and he's like, "What's the language restrictions?" I'm like, "You're gonna fit in just great around here, Ben." So yeah, let's bring him on.
Without further ado, welcome, Ben.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to chatting today.
Well, give everybody a little bit of background on you.
Yeah, so I had the good fortune of graduating right into the whole COVID circus. I did end up getting a job at one of the big four public accounting firms, did a year and a half sentence there before going out on my own and writing basically on investments, finance, and started my Substack about a little over a year ago now. And so I write about a little bit about current events, but mostly about macroeconomic trends, different investments, and primarily focused on the commodity sector and stocks that I think are very well set up for what I think is coming. I think it's going to be a good time to basically go the other direction while most people are invested in S&P 500 and all the basics. I think we're basically in the early innings of a big commodity cycle. So that's kind of what I look at, what I write about, and what I focus on.
Nice.
Very cool. Ben, where can they find you? And we'll give you a plug at the end of the show too, but where can they find your Substack? Where can they read more about you?
Yeah, so my Substack is contrariancorner.com with 2 Ks. That's to do with the last name. I know I get the joke all the time that I'm short by a K, but it is what it is. But
straight white guy going 3 Ks, man. Come on, man.
Kelleran,
I know.
Corner, got it.
I know. But yeah, I'm also on Twitter. That's where I get my shit posting out. But that's also a Contrarian Corner. So I also have YouTube. Been doing some podcasts recently, and that's been going well. So kind of talk about everything from individual stocks to big picture trends, all these different things. But I think it'll be an interesting year, to say the least. It's going to be very, very exciting and potentially dramatic back half of 2024. So
excellent. Yeah, it's nice to have an expert on the show. We tried to give our expertise, but you really went to school, you're educated, some of this stuff. And it's funny, one thing I like when I was reading Ben's Substack, there's a piece we're going to reference that he wrote last December that was talking about what the election means. But as you look through his financial advice, it's Contrarian Corner. And I remember for me, so after the 2008 crash, one of my friends and I, we went in and invested in single family homes, and everybody said we were idiots. We were window lickers. Like, what are you doing? They crashed. And, now 10, 15 years later, it's like, you're geniuses. How did you figure that out? And I think that's the big thing people got to realize is that just because everybody's doing something investment wise, like always do safe stuff, like invest in Bitcoin or precious metals. But sometimes you got to have that contrarian thought, because if everybody's doing it, you ain't never going to make any money at it. You know what I mean? You're just going to grind away. So I love your content for that. But with where we kind of started, can you explain what the U.S. petrodollar is in Smart Guy Talk to our audience?
Yeah, basically, I guess the short version is we basically trade, almost all global trade happens in the US dollars. Like, people can break down statistics and get into the nitty gritty of it. But basically, as a world reserve currency, most trade happens in dollars, and most trade in oil, which I think is basically, oil is the king commodity. So you're going to have worldwide trade going through dollars in that. Obviously, you've had the recent headlines that the Saudis are not renewing this agreement and the sky is falling and all these dramatic headlines. I think it's not a change that'll happen overnight, but it is interesting because you're continuing to see a shift from like the so-called BRICS countries away from transacting in dollars and relying on Western countries and financial institutions. And you kind of hear stuff about, oh, the BRICS are going to have their own currency, or it's going to take decades, or whatever it is. But it's going to be interesting to see how these shifts continue to take place away from kind of the Western financial system.
In two of those countries in BRICS, you have Russia and China. So it would seem like the two main antagonists to the United States. I think people overlook that as well. And you look at the results of sanctions that this Biden administration put on early on in the war in Eastern Europe. That seems to have backfired big time. Can you walk us through? This is kind of off the beaten path for a second, but it always seems like the United States relies on these sanctions. They're going to say, we're going to freeze your bank accounts. You can't access your money. It seems like we've reached the tipping point where that almost helps BRICS countries, or helps these other nations find alternatives instead of really punishing them. Am I wrong about that?
Well, I mean, you look at like kind of long-term history, like the sanctions never really like do what they're intended to do. Like, even where they try and say put a price cap on Russian oil, like that oil is still just like, it's still getting to market. It just is on a black market tanker, or it's going to India to get refined to go back to Europe, and has a whole bunch like of extra intermediary steps. But I mean, the way a lot of people look at it is like every molecule of energy produced around the world is going to get used by somebody. And kind of sanctions, like specifically on the oil, for example, is basically just adding extra barriers to what would be more efficient, right? And so you talk about what happened with the Nord Stream pipeline, and now we're going to be building LNG export terminals and all this other stuff, and it's just not something that is as efficient as like, oh, we have a cheap, abundant natural gas from Russia, and you see like the deindustrialization of Germany, for example, because I mean, they don't have access to the feedstock and the power that they need and all those different things. Like, there's a massive chain reaction that kind of goes on from what happens with energy policy and sanctions, and it's basically ignored by the majority of people in Western media and financial media.
Isn't that the interesting part too? When you look at this, you look at things globally, and you see news from outside of America, and they just report completely different things than somebody who only consumes American media gets. People don't realize that Germany is going through some really hard financial times. Like, they're having a hard time getting enough food. They can't get natural gas after the CIA blew up the Nord Stream pipeline, allegedly. And I mean, we do these Russian sanctions, and like Russia, the ruble, I mean, had a little bit of a hiccup yesterday, and they were talking about that, but the ruble's done great. Russia's moved to gold reserve currency status, that sort of thing. And I think Americans think this U.S. world reserve currency, petrodollar currency, is going to run forever. And we ran up $35 trillion in debt. That's going to take our grandkids to ever pay it off. But when do real Americans start to feel that pinch, do you think? Because we seem to be hitting that tipping point in the last like 6-12 months.
Yeah, I mean, you're starting to see it now, where you have people talking about inflation, and the news media will say, like, why aren't Americans happy about the strong economy? S&P's at all-time highs and this and that. And it really doesn't reflect reality, right? If your cost of living went up 3% or whatever CPI is at over the last 12 months, like, I'm not sure you're paying attention. But if you just look at some of that stuff going on, right? Like you mentioned the debt levels where it's 35 trillion and we're adding a trillion every 90 days or whatever the stat is. Like, it's not going to be our grandkids paying it off. It's basically we're going to be paying it off with inflated currency in the future. So it's not going to be. I mean, that's basically kind of the way I see it, is the only way out. We have to inflate or basically default. So you're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. And I think if you see, like, there's a snowball's chance in hell that the U.S. decides to default, because that basically opens up the Pandora's box that no politician or person in power is willingly going to do.
That's always seemed like the play to me, because as inflation goes up, the debt looks cheaper and cheaper. So if you devalue the dollar so much, 35 trillion right now in our real dollars seems expensive. But if you inflate currency to the point that 35 trillion is just kind of like a year's budget, suddenly it's much more manageable. Do you think that's the trade-off the government and the Fed are making? They're going to say, we're going to devalue the dollar, but at least then we can pay back our debts and screw whatever happens to regular Americans?
Well, I mean, it's kind of obvious that they don't really care what happens to average Americans. And in a lot of places, they actually actively hate parts of America. But there's like, the playbook has always kind of been, I mean, you look at fiat currencies, they all eventually return to their intrinsic value, which is zero. When that happens, how that happens, kind of the path to get there is what a lot of debate is about. But like, I think the dollar is still going to be like most of global trade for years to come. And it's going to take a long time to transition for a variety of reasons, whether it's like people are not going to want to trade in whatever Chinese currency that is could be a potential replacement, or people can't make a gold-backed currency like global reserve work, or whatever it is. But I think when you have a market the size of the US dollar, it's basically got network effects that is kind of unparalleled as far as history goes. And so that's like, we're seeing changes, and it's going to be around for a while, but that doesn't mean you're going to see it hold purchasing power well for average Americans, right? So basically, as far as fiat currencies go, like, I'd rather have the dollar, but the dollar versus real goods or commodities, it's going to be something where it gets inflated away over time. So it's kind of a sticky situation, and it's tough to kind of figure out what to do as an investor or as an average citizen. But basically, I would say over time, if you own stuff that can't be printed, you're going to be better off than if you're sticking your money in a savings account, or sitting on cash, or owning long-term government debt. So,
yeah, and I guess I always use this example, and I'm on a podcast during the week, and Hutch used this. So you got a $30 1-ounce silver coin purchased from goldco.com. This $30 coin I can go trade for 10 loaves of bread. And right now, today, it's worth $30. And 10 years from now, it's going to be worth $50 as inflation happens and the currency's worth less. But it's still only going to buy me 10 loaves of bread, because loaves of bread are going to go up. So the more you can get your money into tangible assets, the better you do over time. So like, your house might be worth $400,000, where a year ago it was worth $200,000, but the $200,000 you trade it for, it's worth less. So that's why we talk tangible commodities. But you made a comment that I want to get your take on, because you're a young guy. You lived in the system. You went to school. You got your degree. You got a job at one of the big four accounting firms. And you said the government hates us and they hate us. When did you reach that conclusion? Why did you reach that conclusion?
Well, it's pretty quickly in 2020. And basically, with all the extra free time I had, I started going down a bunch of different rabbit holes and looking at certain historical events that are like, the standard history textbook story is not what actually happened, whether it's like Gulf of Tonkin in Vietnam or 9/11 or JFK. I mean, you go down the list, right? The history of the 20th century is not what you learn in high school. So basically unlearned all of that, went through and was like, okay, like it's not something that just happened in the past, like it's happening now, right? It's happening in the future. They're planning this stuff. And there are factions in America that have power and influence, and they really do want to see America fall. And there's certain factions in our government and in places of power that are actually fighting for what's best for the country. And so that's where you see some of the kind of power struggle where like people complain about rising interest rates and interest rates being high. It's like over history, like five and a quarter is not actually that high. And I think Jerome Powell is actually doing a pretty good job of balancing, kind of keeping all the plates spinning. And like long term, like the U.S. having higher interest rates is actually good for the average Joe. And it's a long discussion on why that is. But what, like being stuck at the zero bound for interest rates, like the zero interest rate policy, is basically you're going to strip mine the economy, and there's no hope for younger generations to own houses, start families, have anything affordable, because you're basically like at that point you basically created a bubble in every asset. So that's kind of a long-winded ramble on kind
So
of
just
that
to
whole.
expand on that,
Mhm.
if 2018 Ben ran into 2024 Ben, 2018 Ben would call you a conspiracy theorist, a crazy person, all kinds of names. How do we reach 2018 Ben and say you've been taught fake news?
I mean, it'd be hard to reach me. I just had different things I was focused on at the time, but um, I think the best way to reach people and reach younger generations is basically explain to them how you're getting screwed, and it's not just like feeling like something's wrong. Like if you look at real estate prices, rents, like cost of food, all these different things that people look at as like kind of the basic standard of living type expenses, they're not realistic for where we're at as far as incomes and all these different things. But if you want to reach like younger Americans, like it's going to be like pound on the issues that actually impact them. Like they're not going to care about what's going on in Ukraine. They're not going to care about what's going on in the Middle East, because like at the end of the day, it's doesn't have an impact on them outside of the impact of what the corruption and spending and military industrial complex kind of grift cycle has on them. So they're more worried about like how much does food cost, how much does gas cost, how much does an education, or how much do I get paid in my job, all that stuff, right? So I think that's the biggest thing to focus on to get more people kind of paying attention to what's going on.
Yeah, I'm listening, and I appreciate you're parsing your words very carefully. And folks, we are streaming on Facebook, so there's a lot more we could say when it comes to tinfoil ideas here. I think your point, Ben. My question is, just pick one. So Gulf of Tonkin, that is so easily disproven about the narrative you learn in a high school textbook. CPI is the one that we live every day. Like you can look around and say they are blatantly lying to me about that, and just ask yourself if they're willing to lie about that so openly. What else have they lied to me about? And I think that really opens the floodgates to kind of changing your mind and your worldview. One thing I am curious about, I guess I'm going to go backwards a little bit here, because we started the conversation about reserve currency. There's been a lot of conversation. I think all three of us have used the words here. What does that mean for Americans? So we talk about we are the global reserve currency. You indicated that there's no timeline necessarily for when the US dollar gets replaced, but like, what does that mean to Americans? Like, how would you explain that to our audience? And then what does that mean if that changes?
I mean, basically, having the world reserve currency is a giant privilege because you get to export dollars overseas and export your inflation for stuff, right? And ideally, it wouldn't be cheap Chinese crap that breaks down every 3 years, or like the refrigerator you have to replace after a year and a half because the computer in it goes kaput. But the point is, like, you can trade paper currencies for real goods, and generally it's going to be very cheap because we've kind of globalized the whole supply chain. And that's it's basically our dollars, your problem is the short version of it. And now what I think is starting to happen is people realize there's certain things about the global supply chain that's unsustainable, right? So if you have, like, say for China, right? If we get into this military conflict with China that a lot of people in our government seem to be agitating for and trying to push us towards, right? We've got a bunch of military components that are made in China. You've got the most advanced semiconductors all made in Taiwan. You've got all these different things. And then on top of that, China is a big holder of US debt. So we basically have a situation where a bunch of critical components made in China, debt held by China. Like, it's just not something that is a long-term, it, like, China's not going to be manufacturing parts for our war machine, right? So the long-term, like, future of what happens with the dollar is obviously uncertain, but it's I think eventually what you're going to see is there's, I think, probably going to be a couple of world reserve currencies, whether it's like a commodity-backed BRICS currency or something like that. But like I said, I think the biggest key trend is going to be the dollar versus real goods, like physical things and investments. Like, the value of that is going to continue to inflate away.
Jason,
Nice.
can I hop in with a follow-up here
go
just because
for
it's
it.
related? What role does the U.S. military, us being the global military superpower, no question about that. And once one country gets a nuke, I understand the playing field gets a little leveled here. It doesn't take a lot of those to do damage, but what role does our military play in maintaining global reserve currency status?
That's, I mean, it depends on who you ask. There are a lot of people who say it's the only thing that maintains it, right? We maintain shipping lanes, and it's basically, if you threaten to go off the dollar, we're gonna, like, color revolution or like start a coup, all these different things. Other people say, well, now that it's the most convenient and liquid and easy thing to trade in as far as a financial instrument, then it basically just has its own network effects all on its own, right? So there's kind of different camps there. The truth's probably somewhere in between or a mix of both those ideas. But one of the things that's interesting to watch is you kind of have, like, with the stuff going on in Ukraine, for example, like, there's, like, what Putin's doing in Ukraine, like, people kind of look at it as, oh, he's like the next villain of this time or whatever, like making comparisons to a certain mustache man from 1930s Germany. But, like, you have all these kind of comparisons. In reality, it's like what the West did in Ukraine with the coup in 2014 and what they've been doing for years there and expanding NATO for the last 2 or 3 decades. Like, they're basically, like, we basically did this to ourselves as far as international geopolitical policy, and now we have to pay the piper. So that's kind of the way I look at that.
I gotta say, I love when I talk to a younger person and they use phrases like color revolution. Like, they know what that is. I mean, people don't realize the CIA went in, overthrew the Ukrainian government, pushed to get them in NATO. I mean, this is all documented. And Victoria Nuland is awful. And then Putin's like, whoa, I don't want U.S. nuclear weapons on the Russian border. And oh, by the way, these people on the border, they want to be part of Russia. And now we find ourselves facing World War III because of the U.S. State Department decided to go overthrow a country. Those people belong in Gitmo. That's my opinion. But yeah, and I mean, I'm taking it you didn't learn about the Ukraine color revolution in college?
I didn't learn much about current events in high school, college, or even an accurate history of the past, to be perfectly clear. But, like, just to go back to Ukraine, like you said, like, you have, like, what's been happening for 10 decades, and then you've got people in our State Department that, I mean, the way I kind of look at some of the stuff going on in Ukraine and the Middle East is like, it's basically been a blood feud that's been going on for decades, if not centuries, right? And then you've got someone like Victoria Nuland, who clearly has a dog in the fight. That's not just, oh, she's an American citizen. It's like, I mean, go look into the family history. Go look into some of the ties these people have, right? It's not just like, there's a lot of people that are dual citizens and they don't have direct loyalty to America. It's not they don't have America's best interests at heart.
It's not a conspiracy theory. It's funny because I grew up, I'm significantly older than you, and I like grew up in a trailer, and it's like they always wanted to send guys like me to go die in a desert, where these two countries have been having wars for 5,000 years. And it's like suddenly they need to pick some dude from the Midwest. Let's go die over there for this war they've been fighting for years. And it all just comes back to money and oil and all that stuff. So I got to get into then one of the biggest disconnects I see and it's referencing your piece, the beginning of the end or the end of the beginning. And when I went on your Substack, I love going back to look at like predictions to see how well we did and how well things held up. And one of the pieces that I think are one of the bigger disconnects that you did a nice job flushing out is really, why is this open border illegal immigration system bad for Americans, bad for our economy? What I mean, this, other than the common tropes are, you don't want brown people here or whatnot. And it's so much bigger than that. How do you explain it as a finance guy?
Yeah, it's interesting to watch. It's the classic cycle of some of these things where it's not happening, but it's good that it's happening, and you're racist for noticing, right? So you kind of have like the
right.
Just like no matter what stage you're at, like you're going to be the villain for it. So I kind of figure you might as well just lean into it. And I mean, no matter what you do or say, they're going to hate you because you're a white man or whatever. But the point is, like, the whole flow across the border, my kind of view on immigration is, if you import the third world, you're going to become the third world. And it's kind of one of those things I filter through where, like, you're not gonna have something where, like, you're importing these immigrants and, oh, you're importing PhDs and doctors and lawyers and like computer scientists. It's no, you're basically importing a bunch of like field laborers and house cleaners and like low skill jobs, and you're driving real estate prices up and all these other things that kind of distort the markets. Like I think there was a Zero Hedge article from, I don't know, a couple weeks ago, and they were saying since like 2018 or 2019, all the new jobs created in the U.S. have gone to illegal immigrants. And it's like, well, that doesn't do a whole lot for heritage Americans, right? So it's frustrating to watch because you see in certain places it's worse than others, but you basically kind of look at it as like, okay, there's clearly a motivated party that wants this to happen. They want to replace you. They hate you, all these things. But it also is depressing wages, boosting like housing prices and all these different factors. So it creates distortions. It's not good for the culture. It's not good for the economy. And it really just is frustrating to watch. So,
yeah, and I think the only conclusion you can draw from that is that it is intentional destruction. I have my own speculations that it might be people south of the border that actually control our own border. You've had politicians make some suggestions as well to that effect. And I just want to comment too, folks, if you're watching the show, you're enjoying listening to Ben break down the current economic situation. We're getting into all sorts of other topics as well. Drop a question for Ben in the chat there. We'd love to pop you on there and get your own thoughts on that. Ben, I want to go back to what you said. Jason asked the question about, you went through the meat grinder of the education system. You popped out for a little bit. You talked about doing your sentence for 1.5 years. When you were in, let's say, college, in the workforce, I imagine you had some other young colleagues as well. Did you get a sense of how much of Gen Z is just completely turned off from this nonsense and the narratives that we get fed? Like, what % of people seem to support the regime still? And what % of people seem to just be actively waking up?
It's hard for me to put a percentage on it because you didn't exactly, when I was working in like the accounting firm, for example, you didn't exactly get a bunch of contact with each other outside of the Zoom and Microsoft Teams meetings. So you're not going to be kind of talking about some of this stuff. But what I do think has happened over the last 5 years is a lot of people basically look at the events after 2020 as a complete circus. And I think that has started to wake a lot of people up. And I think whether that's the majority, like probably not yet, but I think it's shifting dramatically where like this is one of the things that I think young or older generations don't really understand about like the younger group is that like you have this bifurcation where like the path of least resistance is to basically go along with the agenda and like fit in and kind of do whatever is popular. But that has created like this bifurcation where if you're basically one of us, where it's like you wake up, you're on the right, or however you want to phrase it, you have basically what people would call the most extreme, the most radical. And I think people are going to be very surprised about what the under 30 crowd does over the next 2 decades. I think it's going to be fantastic, but a lot of people in older generations are going to look at it as, well, why didn't you just want to vote your way out of it? Why don't you want to just do these things that, I mean, don't work? And people like you see the articles, it's just as a random tangent, like you see the articles of support for democracy going down for younger generations. It's like, well, if it worked, you'd vote your way out of it. And if it doesn't, like what exactly has been functioning so well about democracy in my lifetime? Like from 2001 when we're going to wars in the Middle East for 2 decades, or COVID, or so it's basically like we see the results of it and we're just like, well, that clearly doesn't work. Like it's just the oligarchy wearing a democracy as a skin suit. So like, why should we support it?
Yeah, I mean, I take the Thomas Massey approach. Let's get a benevolent dictator at this point. Yeah, to your point, democracy sounds great on paper. We have seen it play out for the past, I'll just say 70 years. Post World War II seems to have changed a lot. I know it was just as corrupt before, but anyone alive today has lived through, quote, democracy, and it has just not benefited them. It's only getting worse.
Oh yeah, I'm all for a monarchy, but that's there's a lot of steps from here to there.
Yeah.
So that's maybe a separate discussion, but I think we get to some sort of like centralized power figure in my lifetime. I don't think it's going to be like some global homo type, but that's maybe a different discussion. So
a global homo type. We'll have to do that on the Rumble only part.
Stay tuned, folks. Rumble only.
It's funny because as we talk about like President Trump and everybody saying, oh, Trump's going to be a dictator, it's like as long as you keep screwing middle class, lower class Americans over, wait till the next guy comes. I mean, they're going to do all the things that you think that you're accusing Trump of doing. Now you touched on one thing when you talked about immigration. So what are the economic ramifications of basically importing a labor class? Because you touched on it. I think this is, people say like, oh, you don't want black people, you don't want brown people or whatnot. And it's not that. It's you only can bring in so many poor people, poor uneducated people, and then you need to provide them goods and services. And if you can't do that, then eventually the system breaks, and these are people that are coming in kind of for the free stuff, dependent on the US government, that sort of thing. Can you kind of expand on what you were saying there about how that's bad for America?
Yeah, so I guess the first point there to kind of hit on is, like you said, if you have a welfare state, you can't have open borders. You can't be endlessly importing a bunch of people where they're just coming to take advantage of the system and not. I think that's the biggest difference between immigration 100 years ago, whereas like it really was for the opportunity. Like you show up with like the clothes on your back and like try and build a life. And now it's just like you've got people getting credit cards and cell phones. I mean, you go down the list. It's not because they're showing up to work hard and create something, right? So that's the biggest difference. If you want to have like all these like social programs and whatever. I think that's
Free stuff.
yeah. I mean, the gimme dats is what the highly technical term is for that. But if you want to have that, like some countries in Europe or Canada, like you need to have closed borders. You need to have basically a homogenous society, and that's kind of the only way it really works. And we clearly don't have that now. So, as far as the economic impact, it's like I said, the wages are going to be depressed. It's going to be like basically tough for anyone younger to get into housing because of the real estate prices. Rents are going to go up too. And this is something like it's become blatant over the last several years, but this is something that's been going on for decades where like even since like the Reagan administration, like Reagan is the hero on the right or whatever. But if you look at some of his actual policies, like that's kind of the root of the cause of like where we're at today in a lot of ways. So
I got to say, just top in. I got to give a shout out to Susan. She tunes into my podcast and says she can't stand listening to me. Susan, I love you. Thanks for tuning in. Become a subscriber. Go to the Substack. Wayne does stick up for me, though. Wayne says I tell it like it is. And I got to give a shout out to Sally, too, because I think she probably hit it better than we could have said it. Sally, we might need you on the show. Immigrants in the past were brought in on their own to float or sink. The process has now become a parasitic where people come in to live off other people's taxes. That's amazing.
Fact check true. And, you know, I can't tell if it's because I am radicalized or woken up, but I've just seen some commentary recently. Step one is, shut off the welfare system, close the border. But to a larger extent about what makes America, America, you can take away the bennies. Maybe that deters people from coming in. But even without a welfare state, you're going to change the landscape of the country. You could have 10,000, a million Haitians come into, let's say, Minnesota. Minnesota, as we know, it's going to change culturally, ethnically, even if they don't get handouts from the state necessarily. Like at a certain point with immigration, you have to say, like, we are America. This is what America is. Import enough people, benefits or not, like America changes. Now it's just become Haiti or it's become, Venezuela. And so I think that's the next step in the conversation. Like, yeah, they don't deserve a dime from taxpayers, but why do they need to be here at all? Like, if you want to be Venezuela or Haiti, stay in Venezuela and Haiti.
Yeah, I think from some of the stuff I've seen, there are a couple people I know who around like Minneapolis, it's they basically call it North Somalia in some areas. That
Jason and I are in Minnesota. We can vouch for that.
Yeah, there you go. So, yeah, I mean, you look at where we're going. Like, if we want to fix this, it's going to take deportations, and that's maybe a radical idea or unpopular thought, but that's where we're going if we want to make this America for heritage Americans. And I think you look at like the way the country started, where who founded it, like who is for, like it's basically for the European stock that came here and started from scratch, right? And if we decide, hey, we want to protect that and pass it down to our kids the way we had it, then like there's nothing wrong with that. So it's not magic dirt. It's not some of these arguments you see about, oh, just like there's 8 billion Americans in the world. It's like, no, there's not. There's the people that live here and the people that are our kin. And it's like, that's who we should be focused on. That's who we should be prioritizing. And what's going on in the rest of the world is really not our problem. And it's like, as far as the culture goes, it's not something we should really care about at all. So
when we go somewhere, it's colonizing. When they come here, we're not inclusive enough.
Right.
Yeah. I think we should start with colonizing Canada. That's another separate discussion. So
we need to free Canada. Like the communists have taken it over, and Justin Trudeau, it's like, come on, poor Canada. It used to be the quiet neighbor, now it's the quiet serial killer.
Hey, Jason, we got Paul Reese over on Rumble. Thanks for making the switch, Paul.
Hey, yeah. Paul Reese, he supports us through splitrockcoffee.com. Hey, Todd, do we have a promo code?
Cheers. Yeah, folks, if you love coffee, fresh coffee getting delivered to your door, you don't want to do the hassle of the grocery store trip anymore, go to splitrockcoffee.com, use promo code TODD10, spelled just like you see it on the podcast here, TODD10, to save instantly. And again, subscribe today. Never worry about buying coffee or running out again. It'll come right to your doorstep.
I got to say, we were going to break down a lot of financial stuff, but I find it interesting just getting your life perspective. So I hope that's okay because, for us, part of our mission is how do we reach these people that are just asleep and get them to wake up? Because if you realize it's not Democrats versus Republicans, although the Democrats have been taken over by the communists, it's really the oligarchy versus the working class. And you described our founding fathers like these were working class people. It was the same comment I highlighted earlier. They just said, come here, give me freedom, let me build something. And that used to be the culture in America. How do I start a business? I had a guy cut down a tree in my backyard yesterday, and he was talking about like I started my own business at a young age. I started mowing lawns. Now I own a tree cutting company, and I'm going to give that to my son who's going to take over. And you compare that, you were on the standard like corporatist path line where it's like at an early age in school, they don't teach you how to run a business. They don't teach you how to create things. And then you get in this thing and it's like, oh, just because I got a degree, I should make this money. And you don't even connect the fact that, well, I've got to produce this much money so that my employer can afford to pay me. And when you get on your own, we call that escaping the matrix. So like people in our business, we'll work with a young guy. We'll be like, okay, you're escaping the matrix. Like you need to figure out how you're going to go make money to pay your bills. And like, you don't just get paid for showing up. So talk about that kind of how America was founded and, your perspective now that's changed a lot. Like what were you taught in school and what do you understand it to be now?
That's a tough question. The way I kind of look at America and what's happened over the last like 200 years, and this is kind of, I guess, a separate rabbit hole, but in reality, like all roads kind of lead back to London, and that's in the financial system, that's in history, that's in all these different things, right? From our history as like the colonies and to the revolution to like the wars for the 100 years after that, where, I mean, the short version is that like they wanted the colonies back. And I mean, in reality, they kind of still do because that's the way these people operate. But I think it's very interesting. Like once you start going down the so-called like conspiracy theory rabbit hole and you find some people that talk about some of these different things, like you look at the way like the English dragged us into World War I and World War II and the events on the Lusitania and the events of Pearl Harbor and like all these different things. There's a lot of stuff that's happened in history where like you kind of see the ties back to London and England. And even more recently, like you see, like, are you guys familiar with the LIBOR, the London Interbank Offer Rate?
No.
So this will be like getting into the financial weeds a little bit, but basically the London Interbank Offer Rate was kind of the main benchmark interest rate. And the U.S. had operated off that for a long time. And more recently, we switched to SOFR, which is the secured overnight funding rate. And that's basically separated, at least to some extent, separated our financial system a little bit from English control from London. And so that's actually like a huge step in the right direction. And one of the signs I think is a good sign for America moving forward. But I think as far as our history, I think what America is supposed to be, like we were on the right track for a while, but we've definitely gotten derailed, whether it's in the education system or what's going on in the military, what's going on in a bunch of different places. But I like, believe it or not, I'm pretty optimistic about like the next 10 to 20 years, but the next 5 are going to be bumpy is kind of the way I would look at it.
And it almost has to get bumpy to get better, right?
Oh,
Is
absolutely.
that where we're at? Like we have to do some setbacks. We've got to experience some tough times in order to get back on track. Is that kind of your perspective?
Yeah, I think we need to see a flush of the political system, of basically a lot of different groups in power. And that's going to take some chaotic series of events. It's not just we can go through and replace these people one by one and get our guys in there and then the Make America Great Again, right? it's not going to happen that way. It's going to be something chaotic. I mean, if you look at kind of the whole cycles of history theory and like the fourth turning, all that stuff, like I wouldn't be surprised if we see escalation from what's going on in Eastern Europe, what's going on in the Middle East. I mean, there's a lot of people and a lot of groups around the world that are desperate to see conflict expand because that basically bails out what they've been doing for decades. So,
it's fascinating too because, well, one comment as an old person. So wait till you get to be my age, and all those people that were rebels. Like when I was young, I listened to Rage Against the Machine. They were screaming about the corrupt government and how awful it was. And we're like, yeah, take it down. And now Rage Against the Machine's out there. If you don't get your vaccine, you're gonna get arrested and deported. It's just, yeah, hopefully you never live to see your heroes in the revolution become the bootlickers. But speaking to, kind of the thesis of your article, you see a bunch of huge financial upheaval. Illegal immigration, we just can't afford these people. You mentioned that we need to do a mass deportation. That's going to be painful, both physically, economically, that sort of thing. You talk about conflict in the Middle East. And it was interesting because when we were exchanging emails and you're like, well, I don't really like Todd and I both hate Republicans and Democrats. We think they're both corrupt. We like Trump. And it was funny because you used the line and I'm like, that's exactly why I love Trump. Because you're like, you think he's going to go in and just like destroy the government. And I remember when I was supporting Trump in 2015, one of my friends looked at me like, if he goes in there, he's just going to get rid of people. He's going to lock them up. He's going to destroy the federal government. And I'm like, now you're talking.
yeah.
So kind of explain that while and then we're gonna have to switch over here in a few minutes over to the Rumble only channel, but kind of talk through that thought process.
Yeah. So with Trump, like you said, like people are talking, oh, he's going to be a dictator. Oh, he's going to do all these things. And it's like, yeah, it sounds like a good time. Like, I don't know what the issue is, but like, I hope he's half as bad as the Democrats think he'll be. Cause that's what we want. That's good for our side. But the way I kind of look at this whole like election cycle, what's going to happen the rest of 2024, I think it's basically going to set the table for the rest of the decade on a variety of fronts. So, right, Trump election is going to be big. I'm kind of thinking we get some escalation in the back half of the year and potentially NATO get involved in Eastern Europe. And I think financial markets are showing all sorts of weird, like alarm bells is what I'd say. So
yeah, I describe every financial indicator as like way past the red line, like where this stuff should have blown up, in my opinion.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you've got, I think residential real estate looking like it's starting to weaken. You've got like stocks at valuations which make no sense. You've got all these different things. But as far as the political side with Trump, the way I kind of look at voting for Trump is basically like you're pulling a pin on a grenade, throwing it to Washington, D.C., and hoping it goes off, where like there's going to be collateral damage politically in D.C., and that's definitely good for what we want. Whether he can like build the wall, start the deportations, like get people in power that are actually going to do what we want, that remains to be seen. So that's where like I'm skeptical that he'll get done some of the stuff. Like he talks a good game, but do I think he'll be able to change all this stuff? I don't know. I mean, what I will say is like, do you want another 4 years of a senile old man with dementia? I mean, probably not, right? And the other thing on Biden is like, it's basically been Obama's third term. Like everyone knows he's not in the driver's seat and making these decisions, right? And he's not doing any of these things that would be required. And I mean, I'm really looking forward to like the debate was in 2 weeks, somewhere around there.
Yep.
Because I mean, it's going to be, I think, eye-opening for people where it's like, you can't hide it if you actually watch like the full debate and you're going to see what his cognitive state is. So it's, it'll be interesting to watch. I think Trump's going to win. Do I know that anything's going to change? Not really. It's like everything's up in the air right now. It's hard to make any prediction and say, yep, Trump's going to win. It's all going to be like great, make America great again. All these things are going to happen. It's like, I don't know. It's very uncertain. So,
yeah. And I will say, I'm almost concerned that America is going to wake up to see Joe Biden's mental state, because I want them to run Joe Biden. I think too many people have attached the issues with America that they're experiencing, inflation, immigration. They just make that Joe Biden's problem. DNC can remove Biden, put a new name in there, and say we have a fresh opportunity to ruin this country in a different way. But the American voters are just going to be like, oh, it's Gavin Newsom, it's Big Mike. So, all that inflation, economic troubles, all the immigration we're experiencing, that's Joe Biden's fault. We'll get rid of Joe Biden. People haven't quite realized that it's just an establishment figure. They still think it's the individual doing all those things. I want to just pivot to one more thing here while we've got our Facebook audience. And we're not here to give financial advice, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it seems like you are big into commodities. I mean, I'm a retail investor. I've got my accounts. What's the next step? I think people, when they think about commodities, they're not quite sure how to trade them or how to get involved with commodities necessarily. If they want a more tangible asset instead of just these inflated stocks that are, seem like they're destined to fall back a little bit. Like, how do people get into like another space to invest?
Yeah. So I guess I'll start with the classic disclaimer of, do your own research, not financial advice. Like, if you want to read what I write, great, but I'm not going to tell you exactly what to do or how to do it. I'll just tell you like, hey, this is my strategy. Here's how I do it. So, as far as what I do, like I look specifically at stocks in the commodity sector or in certain subsectors that I find appealing for different reasons. And one of the sectors that I really like is, believe it or not, the coal sector. And the valuations on that are very, very cheap. It's basically been starved of capital for 15 years. And they're buying back stock, like paying dividends, depending on which stock you own, all those different things you love to see. And like these things are trading anywhere from like 4 to 5 times cash flow. I mean, it'll depend on which stock you're looking at, but they're very, very cheap. And if you have all those things set up, it's basically something where, like, if you hold it long enough, it's going to be very hard to lose. So that's one sector that I like. The other sector that I think is very interesting is offshore oil services, right? So your deep water drilling rigs, and some of the sectors around that, where they're basically trading at like 30 to 50% replacement cost, and they're basically seeing revenues continue to increase year over year as the rates for these things rise. There's no new builds coming. There's a bunch of different things that are set up to be, like, I think we're still in the second or third inning of this cycle for offshore oil services. So really what I'd say is, like, big picture, if you look at the cycle of a certain commodity or certain parts of different sectors, like, you have to figure out, okay, are we at a peak or are we at a trough, or kind of where in that in-between zone are we? How are things changing? Where are they going? And so that's why I try and identify is like, all right, does this trend have legs, or does it look like it's going to be a peak, right? Like, I wouldn't invest in like lithium right now because they've basically been investing on a large scale because everyone thinks, oh, we're going to have a whole bunch of batteries for electric vehicles. And so, like, I think the lithium price is down something like 70 or 80% from its high, right? So you can get wiped out pretty quick because of all these things that are going on in commodities. But it's just a matter of finding out where you want to invest, different sectors. But I like coal, oil, broader commodities in general. So
cool.
Nice. Well, before we log off on the Facebook audience, why don't you shout out your website again? And then, folks, for those folks listening, we're going to go a little longer over on Rumble. Going to be uncensored. Language might get a little more coarse. We may actually explain what some of the conspiracy theories Ben had explored were. So why don't you shout out your Substack? And I got to say, folks, if you take a few minutes, go check it out. Some great content. And some of the stuff be a little over your head, but as an overall thing, I love what Ben's talking about, which is get your money into assets instead of like a stock.
Yeah, so the Substack is Contrarian Corner. Like I said, with 2Ks. You can just find it at contrariancorner.com. If you want to find me on Twitter, you can just type in Contrarian Corner to the search there. I'm also on YouTube or any of your podcast platforms. So feel free to check out any of the guests I've been having on for podcasts or any of the stuff I'm writing on Substack, but lots of good information there if you're interested in financial markets, investments, individual stocks, everything in between.
Nice.
That sounds great. Well, Jason, it is outro time. Facebook folks, YouTube folks, thanks for tuning in today. I found this very enlightening and really appreciate having Ben on the show here. Stick around or hop over to Rumble, the American Tribune over at Rumble. Like Jason said, it's going to get spicy. Make sure the kids are out of the room. And we will be back in 1 minute. We'll catch you soon.